stage, and for a lot of the previous session, or at least it started that way, Jeroo was in the hot seat, and we now have Safira putting Deval in the hot seat. And just a very quick intro on Safira. For those of you who don't know Safira, she's the Executive Director of the Vijay and Marie Goradia Foundation. As Executive Director, Safira leads the foundation's efforts to improve health and educational outcomes in India through the support of innovative, measurable, and scalable initiatives. And with that, Safira, I invite you to jam or put Deval in the hot seat on this amazing session with a pretty lofty title of Decolonizing Philanthropy the India Way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm feeling very lucky to be the one who put Deval. Volunteer people what to do. A few months ago, I was talking with Neera and I was saying, I'm so frustrated with you guys. You are doing such remarkable work and you are too humble. For those of you who know Deval and Neera, very humble, often to a fault. We need to talk more about what all you are doing with Dasra. So they said, great, get on stage, interview Deval. So here we are. So I'm feeling, again, very lucky to be the one who gets to interview you and hear really about how you and Neera, along with your incredible team, have grown, catalyzed, and really been the forefront of social change in India for the past 20 plus years. So we will start with a softball. Deval, many people actually may not know this about you, but you were raised in Houston and moved to India more than 20 years ago to found Dasra. So what brought an American, a Texan, to India, and what kept you there?
Yeah, I think growing up in Houston, and we talk about this quite a bit as in terms of the Indian development sector as it relates to the US. And just for those of you who don't know, Pratham, for example, was started from the US perspective from Houston. Indicor was started by Anand, Sonal, and Rupal Shah, who are also from Houston. And Dasra, as you just said, Safira, is also started from Houston. And so I think number one, the way we've attributed this was while there were Indians who moved to New York and primarily went into finance and banking, and Indians who went to Silicon Valley, the Indians who went to Houston were actually quite middle class. And I say that just because I think a lot of our peers did not grow up with country club memberships, did not grow up with sort of access to wealth. And so to a certain extent, it was much easier to look at those who didn't have enough and say, what can we do to make that better? And we didn't have, honestly, attachment to wealth either. And so a lot of the groups, even Magic Bus, for example, is headquartered in Houston. Educate Girls is headquartered in Houston in terms of their US operations. And I think it was that middle class upbringing that made us, made it easier, I guess, to sort of make the transition, number one. Number two, I guess moving to India had a lot to do with Morgan Stanley, which is 3 blocks away. That's where I met Neera. And both of us actually met at Morgan Stanley as analysts in 1997, just down the street. And Neera had volunteered in rural India, working with Adivasi communities in Kharagpur, West Bengal. I had volunteered with children who lived in and around the streets of Grant Road Station. And at a class of 200 and plus analysts at Morgan Stanley, we sort of bonded on the fact that we both sort of did that work beforehand. We thought we would have to be 50 years of age before we can start giving back. But after spending a little time at Morgan Stanley, we realized actually we should do this sooner rather than later. And so I think Morgan Stanley played a critical role in both of us not only meeting and getting married, but also Dick Fisher, the time chairman, provided us funding to start the organization. And our pitch to him was, look, in investment banking, we realized how to invest in companies, how to understand sectors, how to then provide the management of those companies access to not just growth funding, but managerial support, enabling them to scale. And why can't we do the exact same thing for NGO leaders? And what was shocking to us is, unfortunately, even today, when a business investment is made, you give the capital for 5 to 7 to 10 years. You know it's long-term investment. You trust the management team to make the decisions that are right. But in the NGO sector, these same philanthropists or business leaders or high net worth individuals say, I need every line item shown to me. I need to give you money every year. And I will change what I fund on a regular basis. And so for us, it was, how do you bring strong, hardcore business principles to the nonprofit sector? Because it's actually easier than the ridiculous colonization or colonized sort of view that we have in the development sector today. And I guess it's kind of worked 23 years later.
So, yes. In the early days, Dasra was considered more squarely an intermediary organization, but y'all have grown and evolved really tremendously over the past 20 years. In what ways do you think that Dasra is still an intermediary, and in what ways do you think you are different or more than an intermediary?
Yeah, so I guess even at the beginning stages, and Manisha's here who runs Pratham Global, and we were talking because we met 22 years ago in India, and just to give you a sense, when we started out, we were providing funding and hands-on support to help scale NGOs. Magic Bus, Akshay Patra, Vilgrow, Anjali, Akanksha, were just a few of the organizations that we provided not just unrestricted funding for 3 to 5 years, but also managerial support. The grants we gave were 10 lakhs each a year, which was about $13,500 a year. And each of those organizations now have budgets of between 12 to $20 million. And so even calling ourselves, I guess, an intermediary back then was quite different, because we gave them not just the funding from different sources, but also spent up to 100 days a year with these organizations. And so we've been very hands-on. I think over the years, we went from scaling NGOs to sort of helping philanthropists with their giving journeys. The same principles that Jeroo spoke about, we kind of knew in 1999, and we're saying, look, if you really want to be a giver, you need to trust the organizations you're funding. You shouldn't buy a board seat, you need to earn a board seat. And you need to be there not just by giving the check, but also giving access to your networks and giving guidance. And again, these are principles that are common in the for-profit world, but for some reason are still not common in the nonprofit world. So we started advising philanthropists and have worked with over 150 families with their strategies and their portfolio of organizations. And then we started building collaboratives as well. So right now we have 6 different collaboratives under Dasra, from adolescent girls to sanitation to preventing orphans before they land up into government-run institutional homes, informal workers, and really it's sort of been our trajectory, which is somewhat similar to where the development sector has actually also evolved in this time period.
Can you talk a little bit more about the collaboratives? I feel like everyone in this room knows Dasra in some context, and every single person probably has a little bit of a different understanding of Dasra. The collaboratives I want to highlight more. Can you speak a little bit more about them?
Sure. So it was in 2012 that we realized that there was a need to not continuously be solely agnostic to organizations that want to scale, but also look at bringing groups together to solve a problem, realizing, like Jeroo said earlier, you can't put the burden of the empowerment of 250 million adolescents onto one organization. And therefore, let's bring groups of organizations together to sort of see how they can attack the problem with different interventions, different solutions, even different aspects on the value chain, but collectively, if they can sort of create that impact. And so we've managed to direct over $100 million worth of funding to 200 organizations across the sector of adolescence. We work actually with the state government of Jharkhand in monitoring and evaluating the policies that they have for adolescents, as well as providing them feedback loops through our NGO partners on what's working and what's not. And now, in the last 3 years, I've actually trained adolescents to do social audits of their government policies in their area, and then actually meet directly with the elected government officials and provide feedback to these government officials. And see, these are just some of the aspects of our work in one collaborative. But really the goal when we started out in 2012 with adolescents was to shine a spotlight on adolescents. There was no NGO or funder in the country at that time that were focusing solely on adolescents. There was women programming, there was children programming, but we all know when your age is 10 to 19, you need different programming to occur. And it was after that the government of India realized that their RMNCH policies, which is reproductive, maternal, and child neonatal health, needed to become RMNCH plus A, and adding the adolescents to that, because the second you actually bring in a pregnant mother onto the program, if they're 13 or 14 years old and they're a pregnant mother, you've kind of already lost the battle. And so then how do you sort of work with girls and boys well before that time period to sort of change their mindsets and their behavioral change?
I feel like this is a great example, DAC, Dasra's Adolescent Collaborative, of how you guys have really been at the forefront of both philanthropic change, but also NGO change, fostering collaboratives, both on the funding side and on the NGO side, giving local leaders the voice and the platform to say what they need and what change they see needs to be made on the ground. You guys have really been at the forefront of what we now consider philanthropic best practices for years. Trust-based philanthropy, local, hyper-local funding, really what we want to all be doing as funders today, supporting flexible funding, general operating support. Today, what best practices are you working to lead towards, and how has this evolved over the years?
I mean, I think we've always had sort of the principles of flexible funding and managerial support, and that's still something that we hold near and dear to the work we do. And we've been able to support organizations in early stages that are now co-impact awardees, SCOLE awardees, McKinsey Scott awardees, and feel very proud of us working with these groups when their budgets were $50,000 to $100,000, and really supporting them to scale, many of them across India and many of them across the world. I think what we realized through this process, unfortunately though, is that we didn't sort of continue to renew a group of smaller NGOs into the system. And we, Tarun mentioned this a little bit about recruitment and diversity, and we started sort of, I guess, operating in our own echo chambers, meeting organizations who maybe looked and felt more like us versus going deeper into the community and working with groups that are led by the communities that they serve. And I think we took our eye off the ball of proximate leadership, which a year and a half ago we very strongly put back into the frame of our work. We also realized that vulnerable communities need solutions, honestly, that can't be scaled. They're very unique. They have different issues. While education, for example, is critical, when you're dealing with communities who traditionally have followed Devdasi tradition, which is when your daughter is given to the temple for life, or communities that are part of denotified tribes, which were deemed illegal by the British colonizers just because they weren't a legal tribe, even though they're from India for generations. These are the sort of types of groups we want to work with, and realize that scaling their solutions is probably not the right answer, but sort of scaling the number of organizations that we can support in that process. So thanks to the Dasra Foundation coming in and many other donors, as Neelam was saying earlier, the goal is to support 1,000 community-led organizations by 2030, providing them 5 years of unrestricted funding, managerial support, and more importantly, access to funding, so then they can actually sustain their dreams and aspirations, just like we were very lucky to do with Matthew from Magic Bus or Safina from Pancake Girls, or Dr. Aparna from Arman, or Raj Gilda from London and India, but do this with a group that may not have had the privilege of coming to America to study. Do this with a group who will not speak English. Do this with a group who may not have the perfect scalable model, but have been operating in communities far before Dasra started, and will continue to operate in those communities even after we are no longer there.
I would like to just add that I feel like as a funder, this takes an immense amount of humility to be on a very successful trajectory and then stop, take stock of what you're doing and say, you know, we need to change our strategy, not because we're for lack of funding, not for lack of interest, but because we're still rooted in being and wanting to serve as best we can, and that needs to change. So I just want to highlight that because it is rare. Another aspect of Dasra that I feel is rare, and frankly, I don't know of any other organization in India that operates this way, is that you work both very closely with funders and very closely with NGO leaders on both sides to improve strategy, capacity, and impact. Frankly, that takes very different skill sets. How have you done that? How have you grown both those sides successfully and not been weighted on one side or the other over the years?
And it's funny because in the US context, I guess, and again, coming from banking, there's this premise in the for-profit sector of a buy side and a sell side. And it's a conflict of interest if you do both. I think in the for-profit sector, unfortunately, many times there's winners, which means there's losers. I think in the nonprofit sector, I think it's very critical to understand and realize that we actually all have the same goal, which is impacting the community. And so for us, from day one, we were like, once you actually can help the funders understand the intricacies and the complexities of social change and what it takes, and put the community at the center, then everyone, whether you're government, NGO, funder, expert, academic, media, everyone can sit on that same table with the community at the center and work together with the same goal and aspirations. And so for us, there's never been like, oh, well, if you work with NGOs, you have to do this, or if you work with donors, you have to do this. In our minds from day one is, look, we're here to serve. And so if that's the case, and you can actually talk about the community at the center, all of us need to be on that same table, realizing that we bring different perspectives in and different assets in and different networks in, but you need to keep the community at the center first and foremost. And so I think from that perspective, we have been able to not just grow and support thousands of organizations across India, but more importantly, I think we keep the community at the center. So when the pivot happens, which needs to happen every 3 to 5 years, because the communities themselves are changing every 3 to 5 years, you're not questioning whether this is donor driven or NGO driven or government driven. You're saying, oh, but this is what the community is asking us to do. And I think all of us need to continue to remind ourselves that we're in service of the community, not the other way around. And lots of times NGOs get this wrong because they think they have a model and communities need to be told how to use that model. Donors get it wrong more times out of less, I guess, in terms of saying, oh, well, I have the solution because you need to do A, B, and C. In fact, no donor traditionally has grown up in those environments. And so I don't know where they feel they have the right to start making those decisions, but also at times even government and academics don't know what's happening. And so I think the second you put community at the center, which we've done from day one, I think you're able to sort of align all parties together, and whether it's through our collaboratives or giving circles or even the Rebuild India Fund, we're able to sort of use that as our North Star, and pretty soon logic then prevails.
Yeah, and I will add that I think that it's such a boon for especially diaspora givers or givers who are coming from a different country context to be associated with you, with Dasra, to say, okay, there's an organization that is putting the community first, and the communities we are so far removed from. We want to be able to fund in the best way possible. We want to be able to center communities in all of our giving. We don't know how to do that. Dasra, being rooted in community, is able to sort of be the conduit between, and I think that is a rare achievement. I only have one more question for you, and I will make it the same question that you asked Jeroo because I liked it. Deval, what gives you hope?
Well, first of all, I think just to your answer about the diaspora, so we launched conversations around philanthropy in 2009. We launched them in India. We'd been around by that time already a decade, and we had over time met, like I said, givers. They sort of knew the work that we did. They came to us to learn more, but it wasn't until we launched a forum or a conversation like this at a five-star hotel that funders came. And so unfortunately, and I'm sure this holds true with people living in this very city, funders who are local do not necessarily interact with communities that are vulnerable. And so in the Mumbai context, very few funders at that time had done a site visit to Dharavi. Very few funders had gone outside of Mumbai to see what was happening. In fact, when we did the Jharkhand site visit that Anne spoke so eloquently about that she went on, it was Anne and Indians from Australia that were on that journey, but very few Mumbaikars said, I'm gonna go to Jharkhand and see what's happening on the field. And so I bring this up is because it's not just sort of 10,000 miles away. In fact, unfortunately, the way the world works, even if you're a block away from these individuals, you're 10,000 miles away from their lived experiences. And I think in order to engage with the organizations and the communities, you do need to then have a guide or a Sherpa of sorts. And that's sort of the role that we have played and continue to play. I think what gives us hope right now is that the rhetoric around India, for whatever reason, for decades now has been the billionaires and the tech entrepreneurs and how much wealth has been created. And it took something like COVID to help the world realize that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so I think on one level, a lot of global philanthropists who are thinking of pulling out of India, thinking, oh, well, they've achieved success. And yes, we have 150 billionaires, but we also have 1 billion people who do not access dignity or equity. And so it is about sort of the problems are very large, but people are coming to the foray, both globally. Domestically, we've seen philanthropy pick up tremendously. Since the launch of our philanthropy forum, and many of the participants who've attended gatherings like this for the last 13 years in India are billionaires who've committed to give large amounts of their wealth away towards philanthropy in a humble, respectful, and thoughtful manner. And so that gives us hope as well that that trend will continue. And I think most importantly, the next generation, the youth that Sonal spoke about, for example, they're tired of this. They're tired of the inequality. They're tired of seeing sort of the have and the have-nots. There's a lot more introspection of what they can do, regardless of what background they're from, to sort of help the entire country grow versus a small percentage of the country grow.
We have actually a few minutes, so if anyone has questions, let's open it up.
Plans going forward, what is it, what are your own dream scenarios going forward? What would you say 3 years from now, 5 years from now, that you want to achieve, that you think is going to be difficult, but you're working towards that? What would that be?
Yeah, and so about a year ago, I guess, we realized that in order for Dasra to reach its full potential, we should sort of restructure ourselves into programmatic areas that we focus on, but have committed teams within each of those programmatic areas with their own vision, with their own goals, with their own strategies in place, and with leadership, honestly, for each of those teams, like Vishal with the Rebuild India Fund, that is not Neera or myself. And I say that because each of these, therefore, areas have their own goals and aspirations. So for example, Rebuild India Fund will support 1,000 community-based organizations by 2030, really focusing on proximate leadership, vulnerable communities, and providing unrestricted funding and managerial support for communities to decide what to do versus donors to decide what to do. We also launched in July of this year Giving Pie, which was India's first family philanthropy network. We've had 100 members already sign up in just the last 2 months. These are individuals of 2 categories, one that give 50 lakhs a year annually towards charity, which is about $75,000. And they actually declare where they give and how much they give. And then we have ambassador members, about 25 of the 100 are ambassador members who give over $1.5 million annually, or 10 crores annually. And they again talk about where they give and to what organization or initiative. And the reason we're building this up is because we realized very early on with all of our collaboratives that if you can build a collaborative of givers, at least they can learn from each other, they can share best practices, and through positive peer pressure, and maybe a little bit of shaming, they themselves will say, look, why aren't you giving more? Why aren't you giving more? And so the goal is by 2030 to have 5,000 members who annually give $1 billion to India. And that's just through Giving Pie. With adolescents, it's moving the needle on child marriage and early pregnancies and keeping girls in school. With informal workers, it's to help 10 million migrant workers directly and actually institute something that we've created with industry and NGOs called a social compact, which is having every company sort of do a social audit on how they're treating every single employee and contractor across their value chain to ensure greater dignity and equity for their workers. So like this, each and every vertical has their own sort of tenure aspirations to really follow in what Jeroo said, to help India achieve its commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and not wait till, like Tarun said, according to the Gates Foundation, to 2108, which is the current projections given COVID. Somebody's with a microphone. Sundar. Oh, sorry, Raj. No, Raj, go ahead. You have the mic. Go ahead. Sorry.
I must say we are one of the beneficiaries of Dasra's excellent work.
Partner, not beneficiary. Partner, friend, brother.
So there will. What's the most difficult challenge that you face now, as you undertake this multi-year goals and otherwise?
There are a lot of laws that are being implemented on a weekly basis that affects NGOs in our country. That is the biggest threat that we have as a sector. And we need to figure out how to continue the work we do and not get shut down as a sector as a whole. That keeps us all up at night. I think on the funding side, egos need to be left at the door. And I think that's going to take time. Unfortunately, it takes usually 5 to 10 years for donors to realize and trust and let go. And I don't think India has 5 to 10 years to wait, or the world overall, honestly. And so I think that's the second thing that keeps us up. And then I think the third is really just how do you sort of provide hope and inspiration to communities who've lost so much in the last couple of years. There's a lot of challenges there, and it's not just writing a check or saying, okay, we'll do this in this many months. I think there's a lot of scars that need to a lot of wounds, that need to heal, given what we've all seen as a country.
Just one different perspective, just want to understand from your thing. See, the best thing which can happen to the nonprofit sector is that there is no development which is happening. It's instead of viewing people as beneficiaries, view them as a market to be served, by the larger this thing. Do you see that happening, at least in some sectors? And how hopeful are you that, a large percentage I mean, if you take girls, if you take adolescents, if you take, I mean, no one said that India wants to be in the fourth. No NGO said that India is going to do a UPI and make, digital inclusion and so on and so forth. But it did happen, okay? And it happened at a rapid rate with a lot of success. So when the underprivileged are treated as a market, okay, and as a community to serve for this thing, that takes it out of the development sector. And I think that is the best way to, pull out everyone. So do you see that happening in some sectors? Sustainable, financially sustainable development.
And there's some really good research on impact investing, which demonstrate that typically market-driven solutions for the poor are widely scalable if the poor earn $30 a day or more. In our country, we have 1 billion people that don't earn anywhere close to that. And so I don't think we're in any way, shape, or form, unfortunately, at a space that market-driven solutions can sort of end the need of nonprofit organizations. I mean, we just had income tax in India, at least filings, a month or two ago, and I think 67 million people earned enough in the country to pay income tax. And so we are still far away, I think, from market-driven solutions to be the answer. We need philanthropic funding, we need government funding, we need a lot of that. I think the sectors that have been able to do so are livelihoods. So for example, the great work that Neelam and industry does, there is a component of returnable capital there. I think in healthcare, Shankara eye hospitals, what you all have done, and now I shouldn't even call them eye hospitals because they're much more than that now, but there is a sliding scale there in healthcare. But I think the more sort of rooted issues that take longer time, like sex trafficking, like empowerment, like caste-based issues, that will not have a market-driven solution. And I think it's important for philanthropists to understand, and the government. I see a few, but I don't think it will reach majority of our population. That's the problem yet. I think there's a hand up in back and then one here too. So do you have the microphone or? Oh, go, sorry.
It's just on. I'm Sunita Vishwanath. I'm with Hindus for Human Rights, and I have 2 quick questions. Many of the progressive organizations on the ground in India that we talk to regularly are having a lot of difficulty raising money, especially from outside. And I wondered if you all, I'm sure you all are dealing with this, and I'm wondering if you have any, wisdom on what to do to support the groups out there. And then the second question, Hindus for Human Rights, just about everything we do I love the repeated theme of collaboration. We do everything in collaboration. We will be Hindu, Muslim, Dalit, Sikh, secular in everything that we do. And Houston is one of those places that feels, many places, but Houston feels very polarized. And so I'm wondering, given that you're from there and the work, some of the work started there, if, in what you have to say about bridging in our Indian American community.
Yeah, I think the first question, and that's why we launched, honestly, this forum first in India and ran it 7 years before we actually came here. And the first few forums in India, we didn't allow any one from outside of India to even attend. And so I guess what I'm getting at is building domestic philanthropy is something that we realized was so critical and something we've been trying to do for over a decade now. And I think through learning journeys, through education, through exposure visits, we have seen at least domestic fundraising not just increase, but also fund communities outside of the metros that typically don't get that support. I moved out of Houston in 1993, so I can't necessarily comment too much about what's happening in that particular city. That being said, I can comment about, I guess, being Gujarati myself and thinking a lot about the great things that Gandhiji did and what the country sort of is, which is a pluralistic society that accepts religious minorities from around the world to come together. I think that's still a very big part of India, and clearly needs to remain. But yeah.
So you and I have known each other a long time. So you've made major structural changes to Dasra, and you've spent, your entire life building this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now
Sorry.
we can.
You spent your entire life with your wife building this and putting your brand on it in your humble way. So major changes. How do you find talent? How do you retain talent? And how do you develop talent? Because you're really having to delegate now, given some of the changes that you've made. Delegate in quotations, because I know you will never totally delegate, but.
Thank you. It's funny because Neera and I joke about this all the time. Our parents, my parents were both of our parents were born and brought up in India. My parents moved to the US, Houston, her parents in Canada, and both of us were born in the US and Canada respectively. And we sort of moved back. And I say that because in 1999, it was not that common for somebody who was born here to move to India. We talked a lot about the brain drain back then, had many arguments with our parents and saying, look, they couldn't move back, and we understood it, but we are moving back now given the opportunities that they gave. I say this somewhat jokingly because I think at Dasra we probably have supported about 300 team members to come to the US for graduate school education. And many of them stay here. And a few of them are in this room right now. And so we're like, shit, man, we thought we were reversing the brain drain, but instead we've contributed to it. And so about 70% of our team actually are individuals who are young in age, who come in with the expectation of staying 2 to 3 years. And we're happy about that. We think it's great exposure to the sector. Many of them, like I said, do go off to grad schools and full scholarships at Booth, at Stanford, at Harvard. So we're very, very proud of them. But many of them also go and work with our NGO partners. Many of them go and work with large foundations. Many of them go and work with the government. And so I think for us, we realize that we're sort of a good launching pad for the sector overall. There are many great organizations that exist in India today that were started by Dasra alumni. And so for us, we've been very, very clear that Dasra is just an entity. And people should stay in the sector, but they don't have to stay with Dasra. I mean, we didn't create Dasra to keep X number of people employed for 20 years in their journeys. That being said, the leaders of each of our programs that we spoke about, Vishal, of course, being one of them, have an average of being with us for 8 years. Vishal's been with us for 13 years. And so we have a very strong leadership team that's built from within, and we made the conscious decision with the board 3 years ago to sort of build leadership from within, just like Procter & Gamble does. And so we're very lucky, I guess, to get individuals to come on board, to stay some for 3 years, but some for longer, and really provide them now the sort of career opportunities and pathways, which honestly 20 years ago was not something that was available in the nonprofit sector in India, for sure. But we have a long ways to go. And I think a big area of focus for us in the next decade is not just being GEDI externally, but also being GEDI internally. And so we're working with groups on how do we change our own biases in the recruitment process and make it easier for people from other communities who may have not had the IIT degree or IIM degree to thrive at Dasra. And that means behavioral change at a leadership level. That means being much more accepting and patient. And that means providing far more training than perhaps we've had to do in the past. But these are things that we're learning.
Okay, I think we were at
I
time.
think it's lunchtime, I think.
Thank you, Devo.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Safira and Deval. Safira, kudos on unpacking that journey. Dasra does feel, not just to those on the outside, but those of us who are within, like many organizations packed into one. And unpacking that journey and the logic of why we do so many things that we do in response to the needs in the sector was super important. The last thing I'll mention before we do break for lunch, it would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the journey of individuals